Thanks for watching my video today. Today we're going to talk about probably one of the most common questions I get as a guitar instructor, and that is, we're buying our first guitar either for ourselves, for my kid. What kind of guitar should I get? And what they're asking is are we going to get an acoustic guitar and an electric guitar? And some people may not think that's a critical issue or not, but I think so. I think it is. I think choosing the right guitar can have a huge impact on whether or not someone stays with it. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So when you are thinking about what's the right guitar for the beginner, whether it's yourself or someone in your family that you're buying the guitar for, there are three basic factors you probably want to consider. First is cost. That's how much is this instrument going to cost to get you up and running. So if it's an electric guitar, how much is it going to cost to get all the equipment that is needed so that you can play the guitar? And then if it's an acoustic, what's a decent guitar going to cost for an entry-level player? And the second one is, what is the ultimate goal of the guitar player? Are you just wanting to tinker around with it, or are you going to get serious about it? Is it something you want to dedicate a lot of time with? Which leads us to the third, probably the most important factor, and that is, how comfortable is the instrument going to be? How easy is it going to be to learn to play on it, and dealing with some of the hardships that come with playing guitar. So let's talk about cost. Certainly back when I was getting my first guitar in the late 70s, there was no way I was going to get an electric guitar as my first guitar. My dad bought my first guitar, and it was a Carlos acoustic dreadnought guitar. I think he paid around $120 at the time, 1977. And I had a miserable experience learning to play on it. I stuck it out and I learned, and eventually about 2 years later I got an electric guitar and made that transition. But the reason that was important then that is not the case now is that up until about the last 15 or maybe 20 years, but really closer to the 15-year mark, electric guitars were extremely expensive because you had to buy an amp and a guitar, and most of the guitars were not mass produced at the time. They weren't made in Mexico, they weren't made in Korea, Japan, or China. They were very expensive. It was typically kind of a passage, a rite of passage to get an electric guitar. You paid your dues on an acoustic and you moved up to an electric. So let's talk about why an acoustic guitar may not be the right choice for you for beginning. Well, first of all, it's bigger. It's got the sound box, and it's a little more uncomfortable to play, I think, than an electric guitar. But this is for someone that's going to pick up the instrument for the first time, and you want to keep all of the negative things about the instrument down as much as you can, because they'll lose interest, and we don't want that, right? So why is an acoustic guitar a little harder to play? Well, there are two things that really play an important role in that, and that is the gauge of the strings, which is the thickness, and the action, which is the height of the strings above the fretboard. So gauge on an acoustic guitar typically is heavier. Most players that play acoustic guitar want the heavier strings because they have the bigger sound, the grander sound, and you want all that vibration and all that really thick, nice, low-end, meaty sound to come out of that box and really fill the room. There's a price to that, and that is, the thicker the strings, the harder it is to press them down enough to get it behind that fret so that it's not buzzing. And so as a beginner learning to play the guitar, you're having to combat also this heavy gauge. And then on top of that, it's the action. Because the strings are thicker, the action has to be a little higher than you might with, say, a lighter gauge string. And that's because the thicker the strings, the bigger they are. The bigger they are, the closer they would get to the frets. And frets can buzz. When the strings can buzz when they're touching the fret. And so you've got to have a little higher action. Well, that makes it harder to play as well. So all these obstacles that are there for a beginner are discouraging to the beginner. In the 25 or so years that I've been teaching, I'd say 45, 50, maybe even 60% of them just stop taking lessons, stop playing because it's hard. that's one of the downsides, the major downsides to having an acoustic guitar. The advantage to having an acoustic guitar used to be cost, and it's that you don't have to have an amp. You can play it wherever you are. It's not extremely loud. It's not very disturbing. So let's talk about an electric guitar. By the way, this is a Taylor 840 CE, and this is a 1977 Les Paul Custom. All right, so an electric guitar, you can clearly see immediately that the neck is not as wide. The nut here is a lot narrower than on acoustic, and that has some advantages and a slight disadvantage, but mostly an advantage. But what I want you to see is that typically on an electric guitar, the gauge of strings can be lighter. Now, some players like blues and jazz players, they like to have the heavier top strings typically and the lighter bottom strings, or the lighter high strings. But you can get lower gauge strings on these guitars. Like I think on this one I use 9s to 42, I think, light strings. But the point is that this guitar, or any electric guitar, is easier to play than an acoustic guitar. And the reason for that is because you don't have to deal with the action, and the strings don't have to be as thick, and the neck is not as wide. So as you're learning to hold the instrument and make those hard chords like an F or a C, not all, but a majority of beginners are kids, and so they're going to have smaller hands to begin with. Having a neck on an acoustic guitar is slightly bigger, and so having to get around it can be more difficult. All right, so the second factor is what's the ultimate goal. But I think the main thing is what kind of sound are you looking for. The advantage to an electric guitar is that you can change the sound. You can make it sound like an acoustic. You can make it sound heavy and thick, distorted, clean, with chorus, all kinds of effects. An acoustic guitar is great when you want that particular sound it makes. Let's look at the third option. And we've kind of talked about that a little bit, but the playability. Far more people leave or quit playing guitar that I've noticed that are starting out with an acoustic guitar versus kids that started out with an electric guitar. For the obvious reasons that we've discussed just a few minutes ago, is that it's easier to learn to play on electric. All right, so let's take a look at the price difference between an electric guitar and an acoustic guitar, of course with electric buying an amp. So I went to Sweetwater and I looked at solid body electric guitars, and you can see I priced them from low to high, and so I clicked on this lowest one, and this is a Epiphone Les Paul body style. Now it's $119. It's going to sound a little bit more like a Strat than it would your typical Les Paul. The reason I'm showing you this is so that you can see how inexpensive electric guitars are. Now this is one of my students purchased this guitar. It's about 150 bucks. It's a Les Paul. It has a toggle, so it's going to have the two humbuckers, one on the bridge, one on the neck, and it's a fairly decent guitar. It plays pretty well. It's a bolt-on. As you can see, the neck is bolted on rather than on the higher end Les Pauls that are glued on. Now let's look at amps. You've got amps that start out in the 20s. Those are those little bitty ones though, like pocket amps. But there's several in the $50 range, of the Orange, the Fender, and those are really great startup guitar amps. $75, $80 will get you to an amp that could play out somewhere if you wanted to. You could mic it. They're going to be decent sounding. They're all solid state at this point, of course, but that's not terribly expensive. So you take that $50 amp, you got a $120 guitar, you're at $170 plus tax and a cord. That's not bad. Of course, you can always go up and buy a little better guitar and a little better amp. But remember what the objective here is. Get started on the guitar, or get your son or daughter started on the guitar, and don't spend a ton of money. So let's look at acoustic guitars now. All right, so I'm typing in acoustic. We're going to do 6-string acoustics. We're going to then sort them out low to high. All right, so there's some entry level there, just under $130, $140. What got my attention is probably that Fender for $149. Some of my students have had that Fender model or similar model, basically the entry level. $149 for an acoustic guitar is not bad. Of course, you can spend a little more, around 200, 250, and get into the Yamaha or a Taka Mini perhaps. Well, thanks a lot for watching this video. I hope it helps when you go out and buy that first guitar. Please don't forget to subscribe. I'm going to start a new series on those first important lessons, how to hold a guitar, the basic chords, and that sort of stuff. So please subscribe. We'll get those videos out soon. And please also check that you like the video. Click on the like. Thanks so much for joining me.